All right, today is Wednesday, November 27th. It is the day before Thanksgiving, and we are well past the closing of my first ever solo show, Red Herring. The show was up for about 1 month. The closing was last week on the 22nd, and the opening was on October 25th. So I had a whole run for this show here at this space. So I guess I'm just gonna go over my thought process and feeling from when I started to where I am now. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who had a hand in helping me with the show. My fiance, Gigi with the typeface, Lucian with the mat cutting, Austin, Adrian with layout and photo selection, and Jake and Adrian again for zine, curation, and edits. Honestly, it was a huge team effort, and I don't think I could have done it without them. I guess we'll start at the beginning. Pretty much the work that you see on the walls are photos that span from 2015 up until now. Back in 2021, I had the opportunity to join Book and Job Gallery as a darkroom mate, and this was my first ever experience darkroom printing on my own. I did get to see the process in person, but I've never actually had the chance to print myself. So this was actually a huge opportunity to learn as a photographer, but also as an artist in order to figure out how I want to present my work in a physical form. So obviously I had no darkroom experience other than developing my own film. So the task at hand was a little bit daunting, and I never thought that I would get to a point where I could print a whole show pretty much like this. Pretty much I took that time to learn how to understand printing on RC paper and then going onto fiber later on. And I started small. I never really felt like I was ready to print anything larger than 5x7 at the time. And eventually I grew comfortable enough to go to 8x10 and then now 11x14. At the time of this recording, this is probably the largest that I printed, and I hope to print more. So we'll see how much or how large I can print in the future. So towards the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, my darkroom mate, Adrian, asked me if I was working on anything special or if I had a show in mind. Now, that was a really interesting idea because I had never really thought about a show. Obviously, I've wanted to do a solo show for a while, but I just didn't know what that was. And at that time, I wasn't printing regularly, but I was printing enough to kind of get a better understanding of how I want prints to turn out, how I was printing kind of more modern negatives. Modern in the sense that I was printing negatives that I had shot recently for the time, and I had changed my shooting style, developing style, and overall, those negatives were easier to print. So that got me thinking a little bit more about, what would I do for a solo show if I were given the opportunity? So luckily enough, when Adrian had asked me, I thought, this would be a good opportunity to finally take the time to print a full show. Little did I know how much work that would be, but we'll get there. So that inspired me to actually get started and look at my archive and see what I actually shot throughout the years. As I mentioned earlier, this work spans from 2017 to 2024, but not all the photos are that old. I think the oldest in this show currently is 2019. But that gave me a good reason to finally organize and catalog my archive much more efficiently so I could find negatives and look at the images that I wanted to print. Cutting and sleeving wasn't really the hard part. I think the hardest part was to put together a series of images from everything that I had shot. And the photos that you see on the wall weren't initially all the photos that I wanted to use. There were maybe like one or two that started from the first edit to make it into this final edit. But I had this original idea that honestly didn't really work out in the end. And I'm kind of glad. It was definitely nice to get different iterations and different edits of what would pretty much become this show. But the hardest part was actually letting go of this preconceived project or the idea of a show, I think that was the hardest aspect for me to understand, especially not ever really doing a full show by myself. My only experience with having photos on a wall are just group shows, and I typically never have the opportunity to have a voice or have a way of presenting the work in the way that I intend, let alone curating the work. But that's not to say I'm not grateful for those opportunities. I'm very thankful to have been in so many friend shows, group shows, and places where I could show and share my work. After cataloging and organizing my negatives, I started kind of going through my hard drives, trying to select different photos and match them to the physical location in my binders. Now this reminded me of video editing because having a physical and digital archive was the hardest thing to keep track of because of how I had changed my process over the years. But we eventually got there. It took a while, but we got there. You kind of just need to make sure the source files are easy to locate. Also, if you haven't found a good process or a consistent process to organize and archive your negatives, I would probably heavily recommend it. It's definitely one of those things that I wish my past self had done so future me could easily go back and dip in. So hopefully future you will thank past you for being so on top of it. I essentially ended up with around 2,000 photos. And from there, I started to go through all of them. And I'm not the type of photographer that happens to work on projects or isn't as consistent in terms of working on a project. I think I've always just carried a camera with me. And so I've started to accumulate a bunch of photos that have no real context outside of them being a document of what I did that day. So going based off that, I was talking to Austin and Adrian about kind of what the idea of the show or like how people typically go about putting together a show. And obviously most of what I've been exposed to and what they've also told me is sometimes they're projects, sometimes they're kind of edits that they've been working on, things that speak to them that reach out in their work. But obviously most of my knowledge from photo shows come from full-fledged bodies of work. And as a novice photographer or someone who's never put together like a body of work, where do you start? Well, the first question I started to ask myself was, what am I photographing? What speaks to me? And what has been consistent throughout the years? I knew I wanted to have around 20 photos as a full selection. Now, to go from 2,000 photos down to 20 photos is a huge feat. So getting almost 10% of that was daunting. It was intimidating, and I really didn't know where to start. But Austin and Adrian were very supportive and guided me in a really good direction by helping me take away any type of preconceived notions and just start to pick from the gut and really look at your work in a way that you can start seeing trends, you can start seeing ideas form, and seeing if those ideas start to transpire throughout the years. Now that was a really good tangent because at first I had a few different edits, I had a few different iterations of this show, and they weren't good. Like, I'll be honest, they weren't good. They felt contrived. And honestly, it was definitely a little disheartening because thinking about how I wanted to do a full show and having these ideas only for real criticism to come into play, it really humbled me. And I think it made me look at my work harder, but not as critical. And I think that was the most freeing part, was just needing to look at what was trying to speak to me instead of trying to make the words up myself, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but in my head, having your photos and ideas kind of reach out at you is one of the things that I feel a little bit more comfortable with now. I think that plays a role in terms of style, in terms of photo selection, obviously, but I think that's where your inner voice and kind of like inspiration start to kind of percolate. Geez, I'm rambling a little bit. All right, anyway, basically now we're in the middle of like 2023, and I was slated to do this show originally in June of 2024, basically right before my 30th birthday. So I thought that was gonna be a great opportunity to turn 30, give myself the gift of having my first solo show, but that didn't happen. So life got in the way again, and basically we were able to reschedule the show to the month of October, which was last month. So now at this point in the story, we're at 2024. I still didn't have a clear idea what I wanted to do for the show, and that scared me. That was one of those things where I thought, man, I'm fucking up. I really don't know what to do for this show, and I'm stressing out because I don't want to let my friends down, let alone let myself down. So at the beginning of the year, I made a promise to myself that I would stop developing and looking at any new work and just focus on the photos that I have already in front of me, so I wouldn't get distracted, or I would just be forced to focus and hone in on these images that I have had and sat with for many years. And that was kind of a hard truth to realize, that, okay, I don't need to consistently see my work. I don't need to consistently shoot different mediums at this time. I mean, I was still shooting, I was still, making photos and shooting whatever. But now I just have a fridge full of undeveloped film that I need to go through. But I needed to make a hard commitment and promise to myself that I should focus on the photos already in front of me. So basically at the start of February of 2024, I made a hard promise to print and focus on just making work for the show. So at this point, I had already narrowed my selection down to around 40 photos, and that was to give myself some leeway when it came to making the final selection for the show. Now, I started printing pretty regularly, and I felt like I was getting pretty consistent with it and making progress at tackling, printing 20 photos, 40 photos, however many photos. So I was definitely getting the practice in. I felt like I was getting a good groove. And as I was showing the work to my darkroom mates, they mentioned 11 by 14 might be better, or 16 by 20 would be better. And so that got me thinking, well, fuck, I haven't printed that big. All the best I have right now is 8 by 10. And, thanks to their guidance and influence, I just listened to them and was honestly happy that I printed the larger. There's definitely nothing wrong with the 8 by 10s, but having the much larger image on the walls definitely creates this impact that I always got from photo exhibitions. I think it's like a good sweet spot, especially for a 35mm negative. That was another setback where I had to reprint a few photos that I had already printed in 8 by 10, but now I had to make a larger version of it. As I was printing, I still didn't really know what this show would be, and let alone understand what the core through line was for this show. All I knew was there were tangents happening in photos, and they ended up having more questions than answers. And that's something I always appreciate in photography, where you can look at a photo and continue to look at a photo and find things that you would see on the second, third, fourth, however many viewings, and still walk away with a question of what's happening, or kind of conceptualizing it in a way that you can make up a new interpretation again and again and again. So for me, that's where I ended up with all of these photos. As I was printing, I started getting more and more confident with the idea of it, but I still couldn't understand like the true core of what this show was. And the other hard aspect was the physical aspect, which was printing older negatives. Now I've only been printing for about 3.5 years, and I'm by no means a master printer or consider myself to be that great of a printer, but I think working with my older negatives compared to my newer negatives had taught me a lot in terms of shooting to print or shooting for print. I think being able to add contrast and have a more flat negative where you have all the latitude, you have all the information, it works with you versus having so much contrast that you have to tone down your negative. One of the photos in here, it's the tree eyes photo, is one of my older negatives. That was from 2020, and I was really impatient when I wanted to develop that role because I knew I had that photo on there. So I didn't take the time to let my developer cool, therefore pushing the film kind of a lot. So I got this intense, contrasty negative that I ended up having to tone out in the darkroom later on. And yeah, I had a really long exposure time. And for anyone that darkroom prints, the sky by itself was 300 seconds for a 00 and another 200 seconds for the 5 filter. So if you know what that is, yeah, it's fucked. Some of these other negatives, they were much easier to print. There's quite a few flash photos in here, and I started to understand how to expose those images and those negatives in a way that makes the flash still pop, but still has this contrast. But you don't get this weird banding or faded kind of shadow detail that you get from a film scan, which I started to appreciate on, the fiber paper. I think it holds the shadow detail and slightly lifts the blacks in a way that doesn't look faded. Like it looks like a true black point, and you can still see this smooth gradient from detail into basically no information. It was very humbling to print any of my newer photos because of how much easier it was to print. So I recommend that you shoot to print if you haven't done so. And if you don't plan on doing that, at least you'll get good scans because you have enough information on your negative to get the most out of it. So fast forward to the end of August, beginning of September 2024. I still didn't have a clear view of what I wanted to do for this show. I had already made about 12 or 13 prints by this time, but I still hadn't hit my goal of printing 20 photos for the show. Now, I didn't use all 20 photos for the show. There's only 10 photos here, but in the zine, I actually had a little bit more than 20 photos, and that was kind of the bigger edit that I wanted to work with. I wanted to leave myself with enough time to matte and frame everything for the show. I had a deadline of October 25th, so that gave me about a month and a half to do everything that I needed to do. Now, with that hard deadline in mind, I basically just promised myself, hey, you're gonna go double time and just start pumping out these prints and just trying to meet your goal just for yourself. I think committing to a promise that you make to yourself, or at least that I made to myself, was a huge, huge goal and way for me to push myself in the way that I would push myself skating. You could basically look at each one of these photos and see this as one night of printing, because that's exactly what it was. Each one of these photos is exactly that. It's one night of printing. I really pushed myself to meet my goal and get as close to perfect, or what I deemed as perfect at this time, of a print. These are definitely not perfect prints, but they're a good starting point for me to understand how these negatives will print, how they react, and how I can improve them for the future. From there, everything started to get much easier. A lot of the exposures tended to be somewhat similar in terms of how I printed them, how I shot them. So I kind of would already know what to expect instead of going in blind for each photo. I'm really happy with the output of these, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. Going towards the end of September, I was approaching my deadline, and I had already started planning out a zine. And this was the fastest I had ever made a zine for anything, really. This is technically my second zine. I have it here. I had this display copy just out in the show, and it was cool for people to look at. But anyway, pretty much I had this printed through a newspaper club, and it was one of those things where as I started to understand the idea of the show, the photo selection and the curation of the photos for the zine started to become easier and easier because I was consistently working with the same set of photos for a really long time. Now, at this point, I still didn't have a name or a full idea for the show, and that's what was stressing me out the most. What was I gonna call this thing? I had a small meeting with Austin and Adrian about the work, and we had come down to the final selection for the 10, and 2 of them were actually photos that I hadn't printed yet. So I had to extend my printing schedule again 2 more days just to knock out 2 more prints, which it then would be The Guy in the Storm and The Peephole. So shout out to Adrian for making the recommendation. I think these were great photos to have in the full edit. So instead of coming up with the title first, I just laid out everything for the zine. And essentially, I was still asking myself all the same questions that I had been asking myself at the beginning. What are these photos? Why do they speak to me? And how do these work together? And something clicked where it felt like I was trying to piece together a mystery. Something that was ever elusive, but always kind of presenting clues. And I got my brain thinking about mystery novels or detective comics. And for me, I'm a very big Batman fan. I grew up reading those comics all the time. So I started to lay this zine out similar to a detective comics. Not so much like an action Batman, but more of like a noir style mystery. And the idea of the mystery was good to help funnel the ideas because there are so many questions in these photos, like where is this cat going, which is one of my cats. The guy in the storm, why is there a hydrant in the water? What are you looking at through the fence? Why are these double doors, and where do they lead to? And is this person in pain or in sorrow or comfort? I had this idea of all these tangents in one place, and as I kept going, more and more ideas started popping up into my head. And as I also kept laying it out in the zine and doing different iterations of it, I started to get a better idea of what this work is. And essentially, it's all a red herring. And that's not even a funny quip. Like, to me, this entire process, this entire show was always one big misleading clue to get me to the real answer. Now, that real answer for me is my own, and it's come to that realization that it is just one big mystery that I can continue to piece together, kind of like a puzzle with no end. So the idea of the red herring, which I'll put the definition somewhere here. Now, by definition, a red herring often misleads you, it throws people off the scent, it kind of pushes you away from the real direction of your goal. But when I was reading that made me think about how this process was. I kept trying to come to conclusions faster than I would come up with answers. And the more I kept pushing in different directions, the more I had to turn around and restart. And that was always like the biggest thing for the show, was to really listen and figure out at how the work responds. And it wasn't until making the zine and then later on having the physical versions of these photos, I started to understand where my style of photography is going for this current time. I'm very happy with how I got there. I think it's very meta because it still incorporates a lot of what makes me, me and my interests. Basically, we fast forward to framing everything, getting all the work done, and, you know, having everything ready to go on the wall. Now, we had finished the zine, we had finished the physical prints, we had finished framing everything, and the last piece for everything is to get the work on the wall. Now that was one piece of the puzzle that I really didn't account for, and I'm very grateful to my friend Austin for helping me with that. He is an amazing art handler, amazing photographer. Both him and Adrian have a book out at this time, so if you see it, I'll put the link somewhere down here. Definitely grab it. But he helped me conceptualize how to hang this show in a way that just have you come into the show and space and think, the fuck? Like, what am I looking at? And I'm very appreciative for that thought because I would have just done a standard hang coming from no experience and just doing certain groupings and certain pairings. But again, that was also another red herring. And you can see where the theme comes from. So with Austin's help, he basically was like, we'll just like see how the photos speak and we'll just move the pieces around and kind of see how this works. Now with Austin being part of this space for such a long time, I really valued his opinion because he knows what has been on these walls. He knows how things have been hung for past shows. And this gallery has been around for about 13 years. I've been coming to this gallery for maybe like 9 of those years, and now I'm part of it for about 5 of those years. So give or take, he knows what's best for the walls and how to present things because he also gets to experience and hang art in a different way for his job. So essentially the hang for this show is a play off of one of his past shows that he did at Climate Control Gallery, which I thought was a really cool thing. He implemented something he had tried before and wanted to do it here. And essentially, the gallery is offset. You have barely any photos on this side, and then you have all the photos, or the rest of the photos on this side. And this kind of constitutes, or at least this is the way he described it, was entering the world by means of travel, where you have, you know, a very quiet ease in, and then you're faced with kind of these doors that makes you go into the world, and then you take a peek into the world and you see all of this energy, all of this chaos, and you start to question a little bit further. And that's exactly what I was kind of hoping for. This was, you know, in a way similar to a standard story arc, or I guess technically it'd be like the hero's journey or the hero's circle or whatever it's called, where you have entering the world, and then do you answer the call? Do you refuse the call? You answer the call, and now you're thrown into this world and you have to figure out what the hell you're doing. And again, I think that was also a metaphor for how I felt with this show. I think for me, it was sort of following that same journey where there were so many trials to overcome. And now that I'm on the other side, I feel much more confident. I definitely understand my photography better, and now I get to do it all over again for another set of photos or body of work. So all in all, I think there was always this underlying metaphorical journey, or maybe I'm putting more meaning into it than there actually is. Maybe I'm just making this up, and I don't know. But for me, I think it all started to come together in a way that I'm just thankful, you know, down even to the presentation and everyone that had come to the show. At this point, I couldn't have asked for anything better. I also want to shout out Morrison for printing the vinyl for this show. He does a really good job, super dope guy. After seeing everyone at the opening, it was honestly really overwhelming to see that many friends, that many people, and just have everyone here to celebrate this accomplishment. I think without having the community behind me and having friends behind me and having people that I love behind me, I don't think I would have been able to push myself to make this show or even just do something with my photos other than post to Instagram. One other thing I had to overcome was showing photos that I had already shared on Instagram or social media. And to Adrian's credit, this is where I heard it from him, who he had gotten it from someone else. He basically said, photos can also be interpreted like music. And photos on Instagram are similar or could be how you consume photos or songs on Spotify. Pretty much, they're easy to access. They're there for you anytime you want to take that quick hit, get inspiration, and then just go. Now, the zine or the book would be like an album, and it's pretty much the way that the artist intends the viewer to look or experience the work. It is a larger body and could be added onto at any point. And lastly, the show or exhibition is like a concert where it'll just hit you different. You're there in the moment, it's an experience. You're actually moving around with the space, you're looking at the photos differently, you have more attention to these single photos in groups or in pairs or however, and you're appreciating the physical detail much like you would appreciate the physical sound of a concert or, a show. There's an energy that you get when you're in a room of photos versus looking at a screen full of photos. And that was something that helped to break that idea in my head that you can't share photos or print, show, whatever photos on the wall that you've already shown on social media. So having people in the space experiencing the photos for pretty much the first time, even if they had seen it on Instagram or my website, it was very special. I also had the zine here on a pedestal on the side to fill the space, but it was almost kind of like an interactive portion of the gallery where you could see another edit of the work in the space, but in a way it's almost like getting more context, more clues as to building the mystery in your head. And essentially the way that I equate the setup of this version of the show, which who knows, maybe there might be another version of the show in the future. It's almost like an escape room. Like your brain's already primed to question what's going on. And even if you didn't know what the idea of a red herring is or what a red herring is, I think that subliminal messaging does stand out because a lot of people did tend to ask me, so what does that mean? Or what is that? And that was a cool way for me to act as the guide of the story and, push people to follow their train of thought. See if they built out a story in their head or it doesn't complete the thought loop for you. You essentially are able to interpret the work on your own and come to a similar, if not same conclusion that I would have, or come to a new understanding that I would appreciate. I think it's something where when you look at these photos, I have my own understanding, but to hear someone else's point of view and, understanding of the work really humbled me because now I can understand how these photos are working for other people and seeing how they interpret my work. So coming out with that kind of knowledge has made me more cognitive of a photographer, of what kind of photos am I shooting, how am I shooting certain photos, how will I print those photos, and then how will those photos live on in a physical way. So, I don't know. I definitely feel accomplished, but I'm excited to do it all over again and hopefully start working on a new body of work or new edit for a show or a zine. At the time of this recording, I have another set of these zines on the way, and I'm actually gonna print some 5x7 prints to make a special edition for the zine. My first run of these, they sold out really fast, so I wasn't expecting them to, but I'm very thankful that everyone was hyped on the work, they resonated with the work, and honestly, I'm very happy with how everything turned out. So, yeah. Still a crazy thought, still a crazy feeling, but we're at the end of it, and I'm just thankful. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I know it was a lot of rambling, a lot of poor storytelling, but appreciate you watching. And if the zine is still available, I will probably put the link or a link to it maybe in the bio, I don't know, or in the description. We'll see, I don't know. I still haven't figured out how I'm gonna distribute these again, but yeah. If you made it to the show, thank you again. I hope this was a wonderful experience for everyone who got to see the work, and I hope to share this work again at some point in the future. So, yeah, thanks.